Oh my goodness, I am so like crazy excited that I have Maria Cotera with me today. We're going to talk all about everything that you do, Maria. Thank you for welcome and thank you.
And thank you for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you too.
So, gosh, I mean, you like your mom, your dad, like tell us, were you like predestined to become who you are today? Tell us about your journey, some of your influences, all of this stuff that makes you who you are.
Well, Fred, you know some part of my journey because our journeys converged at Stanford for a little bit there. But I growing up in Texas, my parents were very involved in the civil rights movement in the early 60s there and into the late 1960s. And that was, I think, when we talk about my work today, it really brings us full circle back to that origin point because, in 1968 or thereabouts, when I was very young, my parents moved us to South Texas to volunteer to build a radical college called Jacinto Trevino in Mercedes, Texas. And that was, my mother went there to organize their library. She was a librarian at the time and information specialist. And my dad went there to teach urban studies and urban development. He had just finished an architecture degree. So anyway, we spent a year there until there was a Maoist revolt and a purge, and they had to leave. It's a whole other story I won't get into. But they then moved us to Crystal City, Texas, which is the birthplace of the Raza Unida party. And there they worked to build the party and to build political capacity first in Cristal, in Crystal City, and later across South Texas and across Texas, right? So the Raza Unida party was an independent third party that was meant to break the stranglehold of the Democratic and Republican Party that they held in Texas, right? The political stranglehold, and to really articulate a Mexican American or Chicano politics. And so my parents were active in the RUP, and I grew up in Cristal we spent about 3 years there. So that was very impactful because it was a kind of Chicano nationalist ethos. We're talking like 69 to 72, 73, which are that's a major growth period of the party. We were very infused as a town, as a city. There's only like 2,700 people in Cristal, but the whole city was infused with a kind of nationalist and highly politicized ethos. And also highly, we talk about today about police violence. There was definitely an overshadowing of ranger and local law enforcement violence in the town. And it's in fact one of the reasons my parents eventually moved back to Austin. And so, I grew up then for like high school, junior high, and high school in Austin. It's my hometown in many ways. And in college, I just, I was like, I kind of got into punk rock in college and went that way for a while. It's a whole other story. And took a long break from school when I graduated and eventually came back to a master's program at the University of Texas after an 8-year separation from the university, just kind of following a path. And I was very privileged to work with Jose Limon, who took me on a provisional basis. I was accepted into the master's program in English. This is for all your students, provisionally, with no funding. They were going to take a risk on me, and so Jose stepped in. He knew my mom from back in the day, from the Chicano movement in Texas, and he gave me a chance. He hired me as a research assistant, and that really took me on my path to graduate school, because working with him is when we uncovered the lost novel Caballero, which was co-written by Jovita González, a folklorist, and Margaret Eimer, her close friend. And the interesting thing, I love that you have these pictures up here of my mom, because as Jose notes in his introduction, my mother was in Austin, for the years that we lived there, and she still lives there, but for like 30 years, she was a liaison between the community and the Benson Latin American collection there, and she would collect community archives. And one of the archives that she collected was Jovita Gonzalez's archive. And she told a story about how Jovita Gonzalez, she had asked Jovita Gonzalez, she'd heard rumors that there was a novel that she had written. And Jovita Gonzalez was there with her husband in the interview, and her husband, Edmundo Mireles, another luminary in Latino education, said, no, there's no novel. But Jovita indicated to my mom that there was. And so that was always a sort of clue that there may have been a manuscript. And so Jose Limon and I, when I was a master's student, set out to find it. And we did. And so that was republished as Caballero. And I wrote the epilogue for that. And that is what got me into graduate school at Stanford. So, I was really, really
In
lucky.
fact, we have, I think, the cover here, right?
Yep.
Caballero.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when we were graduate students, because of course, this kind of glow of you having already published was, like all around the campus. But yeah, absolutely just incredible that you kind of birthed into and living the birth of the Chicano movement. And gosh, yeah, of course, all of this stuff. And then I love that I didn't know about, well, I knew that this was the way of many departments across the country, how we were being treated when we applied to PhD programs. We were usually shoved aside and put on a kind of like probationary kind of like, hey, you have to prove yourself more than anybody else before we'll let you in. I didn't realize that there as well, but I'm just so happy and so glad that your path led you to Stanford and to all the amazing work you're doing. In 2010, you published Native Speakers, which is an extraordinary book and really kind of groundbreaking in that you bring together Brown, Black, Indigenous women, scholar creators. Why is that research important for us?
Yeah, I mean, well, so first I'll say that I think it's important, if there are any students listening, this book came out of my dissertation research, which was, of course, a kind of genealogy from my master's thesis. So my master's thesis, I really focused on Caballero, which had been recently discovered. For my dissertation research, I took a class on Native intellectuals with Robert Warrior. Right. And he had just written an incredible book. Now I can't remember the title of it. We'll stick it in somewhere here. But an amazing book on Native intellectuals in the early 20th century. And I took a class with him on that. And I discovered Ella Deloria, who was an ethno-linguist who worked with Franz Boas. And I thought, wow, Jovita Gonzalez worked with this white man, Frank Dobie, who was the leader of Texas folklore at the time, and who supported her in her career, actually, in her early career. And here we have Ella Deloria working with Franz Boas, the father of modern anthropology. And I was like, what is going on here? How did this happen in the early 20th century, a period that we associate with deep racism, white supremacy, and we don't usually associate with women of color, in the academic, industrial complex. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to think about this a little bit more deeply. And I ended up writing a dissertation comparing Jovita Gonzalez and Ella Deloria. And then, people kept asking me, well, why isn't Zora Neale Hurston in this mix? And partially that's because already a lot of work had been produced by Black feminist scholars, most of them emerging in the 70s and 80s, who had recovered her legacy and done an incredible job with that. So her bibliography was quite extensive. And so I thought, well, I'm going to bring her into this fold and then really think about, what are the conditions of production that enabled them to emerge as voices in autoethnographic or an ethnographic discourse at this time. And what I discovered was that in some ways, when I was writing this book, late 90s, early 2000s, or 2000s, really, the rise of multiculturalism, something that we thought was entirely new. In fact, in the 1920s and 30s, you had a similar kind of rise with the rise of ethnic nationalist organizations from LULAC to the NAACP to the Society for American Indians, and the rise of interest in the study of the culture of others vis-a-vis ethnography and folklore. And I thought this is really interesting that there's a kind of parallel moment. And then the other part of it that I thought was so fascinating was, you know, the ways in which I felt they were engaging with some of the key themes of women of color scholarship that emerged again in the 1980s, right? So particularly intersectionality. So I felt like, you know, one, we can take an intersectional lens and look at their, like how they were produced and as scholars, right, in this moment. But we can also look for the ways in which they're kind of engaging the intersections of gender, race, sexuality, and to a lesser extent, class in their work. And I think the most important insight that I had in this book was, you know, the book is divided into kind of two parts, science and fiction, right? And one of the key research questions I had, because the thing that brought these women together was that each of them at one point in their careers wrote novels. And in those novels, you know, they focused on the lives of women. And so Jovita González co-authored Caballero. Ella Deloria wrote a book called Water Lily. And of course, Zora Neale Hurston, the by now canonical book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, around the same time. So all of these books that are focusing on women of color appear and then are deeply embedded in folkloric and ethnographic discursive traditions appear at the same time. I was like, what? Why the turn from science to fiction? And by science, I mean social science, right? And one of the things that I found in their writing, in their ethnographic and folkloric writing, is that tended to focus on communities as a whole, and very rarely digressed into, but occasionally did, on the lives of women. And I felt like they, you know, there was something about the objectivist standards of description in ethnography and even folklore, but less so in folklore, that was preventing a kind of authorial identification in certain ways. Like they had to maintain a kind of objective stance vis-a-vis the communities they were studying. But, you know, when you think about literature, that allows for all of these different subjective positions of the author. You can write from the perspective of, you know, the personal. You can write about interiority. And so I felt like this shift to writing to fiction opened up for them the ability to really speak from the subject position of women of color. And that's why I think, you know, that's just such an important moment for each one of them. And yeah, and the other thing I think for me was at that time when I wrote Native Speakers, there was a lot of work that we might call comparative ethnic studies work. And generally that work was about, you know, sort of following Omi and Wynot, you know, this sort of idea of racial scripts or ideas that, you know, sort of racialization is a process that always happens in a kind of comparative mode, right? So that it's emerging, you know, discourses around the Mexican are engaging, on the one hand, discourses around indigeneity, and on the other hand, anti-Blackness, right? So it's like all of these racial discourses are in some ways comparatively oriented or understood, right? For me, I wanted to rethink comparison in this book and think about it more through the framework of a woman of color theory, and sort of think about, you know, how books like This Bridge Call My Back engage comparativism, which is, we don't often associate that with a comparative discourse, you know, in the academy, but I really felt like this idea of coalition and of centering difference in a comparative kind of analytic mode was really important for this book. And so that's why people were always urging me in this book to mash them up together in chapters. I actually kept them in discrete chapters because I wanted to be as attentive to the differences between their experiences as I was to the similarities.
So forward thinking there, Maria, and I love the way you kind of identify here and just now, kind of fiction as liberate the space of kind of narrative liberation, right? So amazing. Now to kind of take a step back again to talk about Caballero and your recovery work, because I know you really are invested in the sort of the space of recovery. Can you tell us about this and how our past informs our present and future?
I mean, I got involved in recovery by accident, of course, through, the fact that I was working for Jose Limon. But one thing that really profoundly impacted me in the process of reading for the first time, for example, Caballero, or even the other book that you have here on this slide, Life Along the Border, which is essentially Jovita Gonzalez's master's thesis that she produced at the University of Texas in 1929, I think, if I remember correctly. One of the really profound things about recovery that actually really is impactful for my work currently in that area is that often you will read these texts which you have been consigned to the past or to some kind of historical obscurity and see in them reflected contemporary realities, right? So there's this interesting kind of time slip that happens, right? When you're reading, like, for example, Caballero, which is really a strong critique of nationalism and patriarchy, and also an articulation of queerness, because in Caballero, remember, there is a central character who, Luis Gonzaga, who is explicitly identified as queer, and in fact has what seems to be the most profound love affair in this romantic narrative, which is, this is a historical romance, so there's a series of love affairs in it. But it seems like the most important one, or at least to my view, was the relationship between Luis Gonzaga and a white army doctor. So when reading Caballero there for the first time, I had this very striking sense that it was engaging themes and issues in Chicano studies that had emerged in the 1980s. And so there was the kind of temporal slip. I find this very interesting. And there's a moment when you engage the past in this way, or I would say the primary archive, right? So it's not what happens in history. Like when you read history books, right, there's a different effect, right? You're learning about the past. When you engage the past directly, and sort of listen to the voices of the past, there are times when they seem quite present. And I'm really interested in this way in which the primary archive or primary sources from the past speak to us in the present moment. Avery Gordon talks about this in her book, Ghostly Matters, as a moment of transformative recognition. In other words, one recognizes themselves in her metaphorical rendition in the ghost, right? You see a ghostly apparition, and I think she's talking about the archive, or like these moments of rupture when you're in the archive and you're like, whoa, that kind of takes you out of this kind of relationality between the present and the past and puts you in a different space where the two converge. I really, if you do any kind of archival research, anyone who does this kind of work, will recognize this strange feeling. And so I feel like recovering the past is important because, not just because it shows us or demonstrates genealogies, right, but also because it takes us out of the present in interesting ways and helps us imagine different kinds of futurities. That maybe that's too abstract.
No, I love it. It's so generative and really resonates deeply with what happened when I was working in the archives at Stanford on the Arturo Islas biography. but yeah, really, like, I love your formulation of listening attentively and engaging with the past directly. So beautifully articulated. So yeah, now of course it all seems to be coming together, right? Can you tell us about the Chicana Movidas? And this is a couple of been out a couple of years. It's now like adopted in all of our classrooms across the country. But yeah, activism, politica, technologies of resistance,
yeah. Well, so so Chicana Movidas really comes out of, for me, my second project, which has not been a book project. It's actually been a digital archival collecting project, and I can talk more about that later. But that project, which is called Chicana por mi Raza, in that project, which is essentially a collaborative project working with multiple scholars to recover the oral histories and archival collections and digitize them of Chicanas in the second wave. So women who were active between 1965 and 1985, approximately. In doing that work, of course, I gathered as many scholars as I could together to inform the project, and those preeminent among those scholars for me are my collaborators on this edited volume, Dionne Espinoza and Maylei Blackwell, who had written really, really important work. Dionne's work on the women of the Latinidad Party in Texas, her work on her article on women in the Brown Berets, had been really important to helping me frame the scope of the digital project. And of course, Maylei's foundational book, Chicana Power, was critical in its recovery of the Hijas de Cuauhtémoc, one of the first Chicana groups in California. So in working with them, I kept searching for ways that we could collaborate, and we kind of just together, decided that it was really time for a volume. We had been working with students, graduate students who were working on this period in each, all over the country, right? So we had been, working pretty closely with junior scholars and realizing that we felt there was a body of work out there that could be published and that could help move the field and expand beyond a single monograph, right? The kind of field of knowledge around Chicanas in the 1970s. And so that's really where Chicana Movidas came out of. We met, pretty regularly to plan out the project and bring it to life.
What are some of the technologies that are used? Of course, the camera eye, but were there others that you were particularly surprised by, or that you hadn't thought of when you started the project?
Right. I mean, this idea of technologies of resistance really comes out of I would say it's a very capacious definition of technology. So it's not just actual media, right? Which, although that is quite important, but also, the ways in which Chicanas are reconceptualizing politics on the ground to move in and through and around modalities of power, right? That want to constrain or limit in some ways the analytic scope of resistance, right? So technologies of power being, let's say, nationalism, or technologies of power being, second wave feminism, which are very reductive, that could be very reductive ideologies in terms of understanding oppression. Like, our problem is colonization and race, right? Or racism, or our problem is patriarchy and sexism. And so for us, technologies of resistance are these sort of conceptual categories that move beyond those limiting or monocausal understandings of oppression. At the same time, I think that the book definitely, engages technologies on a in terms of media technologies. And the cover of the book, that's why we chose the cover of the book, right? Because it's actually a photo, a self-portrait of Nancy de los Santos, who was a photographer in Chicago, right? And documented a bunch of movement activities there. But there's also technologies in the book like radio, right? So there's a wonderful article by Monica de la Torre that's about a radio station in the Pacific Northwest. There's the technologies of, in my piece in that collection, I talk about the Chicana por mi Raza project as a digital technology that in many ways reflects the ethos of earlier engagements with technology. And, at the end of that chapter, I talk about how my mother had a database in the early 1980s, an early database technology to create an encyclopedia of Latin American women. So there's a kind of full complement of technologies, although I think, there is important work to be done, actually, still excavational work on the ways in which technologies like the mimeograph machine or the, offset printing, certainly photography, in the sense of, the Brownie camera and other cameras that were easy and portable. And, those kinds of technologies were incredibly impactful. The slideshow, like I am totally obsessed with the slideshow as a media technology of the 1970s because it's everywhere, and it was a consciousness raising tool, right? So you could record your narration, attach it, send it to someone with a slide reel and have them just, do a presentation from afar of whatever your research was or whatever you were trying to raise consciousness about, without you having to be there. So these kinds of technologies, I think, are very understudied in the current moment, and they're a rich place to think about the 70s in particular.
Wow. Yeah. I'm so glad we have like all these amazing graduate students, right? So that, so much to do, so much for us to do. So here we have, like, as you mentioned, your Chicana por mi Raza, your sort of project, your digital memory project. You've talked a little bit about this, but gosh, yeah. How is this kind of liberating the feminist archive?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just recently returned to the first article I wrote about this, where that idea of liberating the feminist archive comes out of. And one of the things that for me was really important, and after I'm not like you. You've written how many? 100 books nearly. Yeah, I'm very jealous of your productivity, but after I wrote Native Speakers, I felt frustrated by the disconnect between what I was seeing and seeking in Native Speakers, the sense of coalitional ethos or identity, even kind of wanting to push these three women together who never met, but as a feminist collective, right? I imagined a feminist collective of them, and thinking about the conditions of production that really shape our work as scholars. And it's things we don't really think about, right? So if we're historians, there's the archive already. Like that's our base of evidence, right? And the archive, I knew from doing this archival work in my first book, is very limited. Like things are lost. Their materials are not collected. This is especially true with the Chicana archive. And because the first books that came out about the Chicano movement were written by men who had participated in the movement and who had built careers out of it. But I knew from my mother's own experience and from the experience of her friends that there's a ton of women from that generation that were pushed out of Chicano studies or allowed to just fall away, right? Men's careers were really, put forward and promoted, and women, especially feminists, were kind of pushed to the margins, and sometimes, purged, as in the case of Ana Nieto Gomez. And I don't think purged is too hard a word. And so I knew from personal experience that and also because my mother was a librarian, she built various libraries. So she built a library for Jacinto Treviño. When that project fell apart, she rebuilt the library in Crystal City as a city librarian and the high school librarian there. She wore two hats. She came back to Austin and she built another library around another university project, Colegio Juarez Lincoln, the Juarez Lincoln University. And she worked as an archivist for 30 years. So, you know, in our home, we were surrounded by archives. There was the Chicana archive, it was like thousands of things, chapbooks, newspapers, photographs, correspondence. So there was this proliferation of archival knowledge in my home, but it was not actually in libraries. And so, you know, when I thought about like my experience going to archives and searching, right? And in the case of Jovita González, they're not really, you know, her most important work not even being in the archive, you know, really made me think like, if that's the evidentiary base for our understanding of the past, the institutional archive, we're screwed. Because there's this whole other archive, an archipelago of documents and memory that is not reflected in the institutional archive. And there's a feedback loop in the archive too, where it's like, you know, if you're not in the archive, people can't write, they can't discover you, they can't write books about you. And if no books are written about you, a librarian cannot make the argument that you deserve to be in the archive, right? Because it's also a resource argument. And so this feedback loop that was invisibilizing Chicana activity in the 1970s, I felt had to be interrupted. And so in that way, it was like, you know, liberating the feminist archive really comes out of that. Like, how do we liberate the feminist archive? On one level, where are we looking for primary source material? But on another level, I wanted, it was no good. Like, if I were going to engage in this recovery project, I didn't want to recover the materials just to have them contained once again in the library and not accessible to everyone. And, you know, in looking at these materials, I was really profoundly impacted by their collectivist nature, by the idea of creating knowledge outside of institutions, of self-determination. You know, all of these ideas that come from the 1970s, and not just the Chicano nationalist kind of idea of self-determination, but also women's liberation. And, you know, things like the Feminist Herstory Archive and archives that exist outside of the institution. And so, you know, Linda Garcia Merchant and I, who we collaborated from the very beginning on this project, we were really wanting to figure out a way to collect and preserve these materials without kind of forcing them into the box of an institutional collection. So how could we replicate in our approach the collectivist and radical and revolutionary knowledge making, which largely happened outside of institutions that we were collecting? In other words, I didn't want to collect all this knowledge to just be drawn into an extractive economy of scholarship, where scholars make meaning out of knowledge that is essentially not theirs through their access to, you know, I'm the interpreter, right? So I did not want to do that. And that's why I didn't write another book. That's why I didn't collect an archive to write a book to interpret. You know, I was more interested in thinking about the archive itself as a product, as a collective, and what would that mean if instead of, as scholars normally do, collecting an archive, or a radical archive in this case, keeping it in your little files, not sharing it with anyone because it's yours and you want to get your big scoop out, you know, and then, you know, what would it mean if, as a scholar, I shared the archive first?
Wow, seriously, this public living, breathing archive that you have put out into the world. So absolutely incredible. Maria, thank you for that work. Oh my goodness. You are also an award-winning teacher, beloved teacher. Can you share, I don't know, the Cotera kind of trademark teaching kind of style or method, or
Right. It's changed a lot since engaging the project. And, you know, just to touch back a little bit on this idea of transformative recognition, I feel like engaging the archive has transformed the way I understand scholarship, the way I understand teaching, And one of the most important and influential sort of experiences I've had in how I think about teaching today, which is really different than how I thought about teaching up until I started doing this work, is the example, the pedagogical example of Chicanas in the 70s who were like Chicanos, like so early Chicano studies departments were really engaged very early on in learning and embedded in the community. And also learning for the community. So, you know, making sure that there's these connections, these bridges between the knowledge you're producing and how it serves a community, but also, you know, because if you can imagine a Chicano or Chicana syllabus in 1972, there's not a ton of material you can put on that syllabus. So in many cases, like what's happening in those classrooms is people are going into communities, working in communities, and producing action research projects that are then being fed back into communities. And I can give you a great example of this. You know, so Ana Nieto Gomez teaches a class on La Chicana in 1972. At the end of that class, the project is we don't know enough about La Chicana, so we're going to do a whole week of a symposium. And that's our project. We're going to organize a symposium called Semana de la Mujer. In that symposium the following semester, all of these people who are doing work in the community, all these women are brought in, and also, you know, academics, and they give presentations. Adelaida del Castillo is brought in, and many others. And so the product of that, right, seminar or week of activity is that the Chicanas who participate, the students, are tasked with doing reports on each of the presentations. And then they produce a newspaper, El Popo Femenil. So at the end of all of this, you have this newspaper that's a kind of textualized reportage of the research that's happening on the ground, of something they organized that brought that research to the public. And it's so this is this full cycle, right? And now we have El Popo Femenil, which was designed at that time to say, you know, to the people who said there's no materials on the Chicana for you to teach a class on, to say, oh no, we have this, right? We have this collection of writing about women in prison, about sort of Juan Inés de la Cruz, you know, about this sort of very broad collection of topics, right? So this sort of model, pedagogical model, right, which engages students to identify a problem. Okay, so what are we facing? How do we solve it? And to put it into action, your whatever proposed solution you have to put into action, and then to produce something out of it that's a knowledge form. That thing, it can inform the next sort of class or whatever. That was really a profound insight for me, because it's more than community-based learning, right? It's about getting students to think about the work that they do in and for the class as not just work to be presented to you to satisfy whatever metric you have in your head as the instructor, right? But as something that has a life outside of the class, as something that will continue knowledge outside of the class, or contribute to the knowledge base outside of the class. And then on the other hand of that, you know, on the other side of that is like a rejection of top-down delivery models of knowledge where, you know, sure, you know, as an instructor, you know a lot that you can share with the students. But if you're working collectively on a project, you know, in many ways, there are horizontal relations of knowledge production that are being activated in the class. Sure, you may have a set of readings for them, but in many ways, you're engaging collaboratively in this project. And so I'll just say that, you know, an example of how I applied this kind of model in my teaching more currently in, I guess it was last year, I can't remember when it was, but we celebrated at the University of Michigan our 200th anniversary. And there was a big to-do about it. And everyone was like congratulating ourselves at being so old. And in all of the materials that the University of Michigan presented, there was not a single Latinx individual or organization presented as part of that history. Now, this was immensely frustrating because at that time, there was a new organization, La Casa, that was very radical and that was making demands for changes. all across the university, and more Latinx faculty and more Latinx administrators and more Latinx staff to serve a growing Latinx population. And so I basically took this idea of the 200th anniversary and the website that they produced and started with the question, like, what would this look like if it included Latinx people and communities? And is there even a history of Latinx people and communities at the University of Michigan? Because apparently, according to this self-representation, there isn't. So I organized a class where we're going to say, it just began with that question: is there a history of Latinx communities and people? And it was all, the students took this on, and they decided they wanted to make a parallel site to the university's site, storytelling site. That was our project. We went to the Bentley. We started with just like a list of Latinx members in a yearbook in I think it was called the Latin American Club, and began just tracing them and their activities. And students took on different decades, and they produced a website called Presente that documents, this incredible history that the university was entirely unaware of, and they did it. And I'll just, a coda on this, which is really powerful, is that La Casa had responded to a hate crime that was committed against Latinx students, and the university had been having meetings with them. And La Casa was formed, and the university kept telling them, oh, these are new issues. We've never heard of this. But those students in La Casa were in the class, and they studied the 1970s, and they saw that their list of demands was replicated in the demands made by Latinx students in 1972 on the university. And so the next time they met with officials, they said, don't tell us this hasn't happened before. And they had the archive. And so their political strategizing was being actively informed. And again, we come back to this idea of transformative recognition, which goes beyond history repeating itself, right? But it's like their activism in the present moment, their demands were informed by the list of demands from 1972 from Mecha, and other activities. And so for me, students always say they hate history, but that's just because they hate being just fed, knowledge that they think they have to memorize. If they're making history, they actually don't hate it. They love that. And so we have our website is still up, and we still get people like typing in the comments like, oh, this is, you mentioned my grandfather here, or my great grandfather, or whatever. And so it's this wonderful, thing that continues to live outside of the classroom. And that's what I've learned from my work, actually.
Wow. I love, geez. So much there for me to think about, for all of us to think about. You also, I say teaching by other means because of your exhibits that you've curated. And you've kind of talked a little bit about some of this, but can you go into a little more into like why kind of exhibitions are important, how they can be a part of this public learning, this horizontal kind of lined knowledge production space?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's a great follow-up question, actually, because, these, you have pictures of a couple of we've done 2 shows related to the Chicana por mi Raza archive. And both of those shows were really curated and created by students and through partnerships in classes. And so, Las Rebeldes, which is the image you're showing, the black and white image of the woman on the railroad tracks, that came out of, for years I'd been working with undergrads through different programs and internships on the Chicana por mi Raza project. And in 2013, I just decided, well, I'm going to do a class and see if I can make a model class that helps us collect materials for the project. And the idea behind the class was like, I can give this set of materials to folks all over the country. And if they want to teach an oral history class that contributes items on oral histories to the archive, then they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, here's everything from equipment lists to assignment structures, everything, right? And so Las Rebeldes was a project that came out of an oral history class that the sort of template for this model that I taught in 2013, where students in groups went out and interviewed 4 women. And then we created a show in Southwest Detroit in an abandoned house that was only up for like 2 days. But it was really an amazing and profound experience, because we started with the collection process in the class, and then the following semester, the students worked in tandem with a class in art and design and exhibition to create this show and to bring it to life. And then with Chicana Photos, the next iteration of that, we started with this incredible collection of several thousand images that Nancy de los Santos had taken in the mid 1970s in Chicago. And the reason these images were so incredibly important was that there's very little documenting the Chicano movement in Chicago and in the Midwest more broadly. And what she had done is, really documented the UFW struggles and collaborative struggles between, the young lords and Black liberation activists and Chicanos, which is very specific to the Midwest. And, from like 1973 to 1980 or so. It's a really rich moment. The Walter Reuther collection in Detroit has an incredible collection of UFW materials. It's one of the sites where lots of researchers go. So we partnered with them and a class in art and design, again, an exhibition class, and paired her images from Chicago with their archival documents documenting the Midwest struggles of the UFW, and did this incredible show, Chicana Photos, that really kind of, I always think of it as an illuminated text, because their archive is primarily a textual archive, right? Correspondence, posters, things like that. And whereas we had the images that go with that archive. And so in this interesting partnership between my public history project, El Museo del Norte, the Walter Reuther collection, and this class in exhibition design, we were able to bring Chicana Photos to life in their gallery. And it brought community, the Detroit community, larger Southeastern Michigan community together. We had a ballet folklorico performance. I mean, it was, the Walter Reuther Library I don't think they'd ever had a ballet folklorico performance in their gallery. So it was amazing. And I do think, so what I will say is, like, digital archives are awesome. And they have totally helped us to accumulate an incredible collection of objects from the 1970s. But community events are really important, because there's a lot of people, especially elders, who are not, and also children, we had a lot of classes come to the exhibit, who may not have access to the archive or interest in accessing it. And so this really, brings people together in very interesting ways. So yeah, it's a really important part of it.
Wow. The gift that keeps on giving, right?
Yes, that's very true.
I know this is kind of like maybe a little bit of a kind of radical shift, but maybe not. But I think about this moment in early 2020, and you and I've talked about this, that it feels like this happened years ago. But anyway, when we had Shakira and J-Lo and the halftime Super Bowl, and it created such a kind of weird series of responses that I thought I would throw this slide up and just see how you responded, but also how your kind of knowledge making and your own, how it might inform our interpretation, our reading of this.
I see that those kids in cages, that image, and it still it made me really mad when I saw it. And it brings up the same feelings. Like, I know there's across the spectrum, and especially in Latino studies community, very different and divergent opinions about this moment. And I know that there's obvious issues, and in these images, it's very clear, the sexualization of Latinas. But for me, this moment was such a disappointment because of the ways in which these performers stepped in a wake that was created by anti-Blackness. And, you know, what really, like, I was so upset about it that I didn't even notice the children in glittery cages. Like, that didn't happen until after. And then I was even more upset. But for me, you know, when I think about Chiquita and J-Lo, I really think about a different moment in Latino pop culture, right, where the appropriation of Blackness or Black traditions or Afro-Latino traditions was not quite as highlighted as it is in the current moment, you know, when we are much more aware of how white presenting Latinos have appropriated particularly Black culture, right? And, you know, I think J-Lo and Chiquita are examples actually of this, and it wouldn't be a problem, right, for me. Well, it still would be a problem, but for me, the contradiction, right, of them representing a kind of alternative or, you know, marginal ethnicity, or this gesture of the NFL to, like, you know, inclusivity, really played into very problematic discourses that I see a lot of, you know, the sort of, and we've had this for a long time, the rising tide, right, of Latinx people and questions of representation and all of these questions that arise, like, around, you know, representation, that kind of take us away from other questions that are equally important, which is, you know, the ways in which Afro-Latinidad have been kind of erased, you know, in the Latino, you know, how Latinos are represented, right? And I just think it was really, I don't know, I was really disappointed, right? That in this kind of substitution move, the NFL is like, no Black, you know, no Black entertainers, or very few Black entertainers will, you know, will perform, right? Because of the Colin Kaepernick situation and the attention to anti-Blackness and white supremacy that brought to the NFL. So we'll turn to the next best alternative, you know, and the fact that Latino performers did not support that boycott was just so disappointing to me. But I think that was a specific moment, right? And I think it's a very different moment right now. I just feel like there's interesting questions being asked about the saliency of Latinidad in the first place. Like, what is this category? And it's a pressure point for us right now as Latino studies scholars, like, to really think about, you know, what it means to demand representation, which is a demand that needs to happen, right? But at the same time, you know, understand that in many cases, as with what happened to the last award show, the Emmys, where people where John Leguizamo was saying, well, you know, there's no Latinos, and then as it turns out, you know, there were several Afro-Latinos nominated, I believe. And this really raised questions about, like, in what ways are Afro-Latinos being incorporated into ideas of Latinidad? You know, we have to contend with the anti-Black racism in our own culture, and in our responsibility to, I don't know, you know, so it's a difficult moment for me.
And, you know, I think this moment, the Super Bowl moment, just like, you know, the kind of barrage of ways that we are framed and even erased, right, in the mainstream, but also at home. You know, like my tia, who's more Afro-Latina, you know, later on as a teenager, I'm asking questions like, why wasn't she invited to Christmas dinner?
Oh my God.
Right? Seriously.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. Well,
there's
racism
some deep,
in our own family.
Yeah. Deep stuff. Right.
Right. And I'll also say that, you know, there's the other side of that, and that's the anti-Indigenism that we have. And, you know, these are all after effects of colonization and that trauma that we still live in. And so in our culture, if you can say there is a Latino culture, I think hallmarks of that culture are anti-Indigenism and anti-Blackness. And it's incredibly, it's a difficult legacy.
Yeah, there's that dark side that we don't really talk about that becomes a kind of common thread. You're so right, and so sort of beautifully articulated to like bring us to a more positive end here. Where do you see then the vitality in what we might call living Latinx cultura today?
I really think it's the vitality is precisely in its kind of metamorphizing identity. Like on the one hand, you can say, like, the previous slide about representation, I think it matters. Like, I'm not making an argument for the fact that it doesn't matter, but this idea of like, well, we're always represented as buffoons or this or that. I think it's true, but then how do we as a community start pushing images of ourselves that can account for the heterogeneity of Latinx identity, Afro-Mexican, Afro-Latino, Indigenous, how do we engage like Mayan communities in Georgia or in LA? What does it mean to fully incorporate Central American identities and Latinx identities so it's not quite so Mexican predominant or Puerto Rican predominant? All of these questions around the heterogeneity of Latinx communities, identities, histories, I think are, on the one hand, they can frighten us because they suggest a kind of breaking apart, or like Latinidad is not real, it's a construct, and and so it could mean like the end of Latino studies. Like, really, I mean, what are we talking about here? On the other hand, I think it's like, I think that Latino communities, Latino cultures, especially youth communities and cultures, are engaging with these issues head on, are thinking about anti-Blackness, are centering Afro-Latino experiences and Indigenous experiences. To me, there are kind of guideposts for where we need to go. And, I think that there is a tremendous possibility in the dangerous heterogeneity that is always constantly threatening to break apart. I think it pushes us to think about whiteness in different ways. It pushes us to think about Blackness in different ways, or indigeneity in different ways. So the Latino, I think, becomes a kind of sign of that disruptive, mode of thinking about race, history, that I think is potentially really powerful. Because we know, like, we can say, like, yeah, there's our communities are Black, they're Indigenous, they're white, but that also sort of highlights Blackness as a construct, indigeneity as a construct, whiteness as a construct, important constructs that we need in some ways to hold on to, but always with that kind of shadowing of kind of undermining or destabilizing them. So yeah.
Wow. What can I say? You've taken us on this mind-blowing journey from time slips, primary archives, attentive listening, transformative recognition, horizontal learning practices. Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wow.